did Brexit affect the UK's treaties network? So yes, it did. And one needs to appreciate that Brexit had a significant impact as the UK's treaty network is quite large and very, appropriate that one raises this point due to the fact that the UK has a large treaty network. So if we look firstly at trade agreements, the loss of EU trade agreements, before Brexit, the UK benefits from over 40 trade agreements, and the EU had negotiated with over 70 countries. Upon leaving, these agreements cease to apply to the UK, and you have to then negotiate new rules or new deals, and that can become quite cumbersome, but it's also, you can use it, you can also replicate existing EU agreements. But the point is you have to renegotiate. So the new UK trade deals, that's now post-Brexit, what took place was there were many free trade agreements, including UK-EU trade and cooperation agreements, and these govern trades between the UK and the EU, as it says, but imposes new customs and regulatory barriers. The UK-Japan FTA agreement had to actually also be modelled, but with additional UK-specific provisions to cater for situations. Then you have the UK-Australia and UK-New Zealand FTAs, financial trade agreements. The first trade deals negotiated from scratch. It's quite an interesting point to make. And then you have your UK has joined the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. So one needs to understand there were various new trade deals or new arrangements that came in place. The loss of the EU single market benefits means that the UK-EU trade now faces customs checks, VAT complications, and rules of origin compliance. And that's why one needs to go and actually understand this. And again, I would like to reiterate that it's important to involve counsel or legal support. So the UK's bilateral tax treaties remain valid. There are over 130 DTAs, which were negotiated independently of the EU. And Brexit did not terminate those treaties. The loss of EU directives, withholding taxes, the UK lost benefits from two EU tax directives, the parent subsidiary directive and the interest and royalties directive. And one needs to also be aware of that. So the UK's approach to BEPS and OECD standards, it continues to align with OECD tax policies. For example, the Pillar 2 global minimum tax, that's an example, but it's actively participating in the OECD's tax treaty network. So that brings us to another subdivision, which is investment treaties, and that's your bilateral investment treaties. And the UK retains these existing bilateral investment treaties, and they will remain valid post-Brexit. The loss of the EU investment protections, that will be applicable as the UK no longer benefits for all protection under EU law. They will have to rely on either international law or their own law. So if you go and look further and you look at the UK-EU dispute settlement mechanisms, those also changed, and there's no access to the EU's investment court system. UK investors must now rely on bilateral or WTO dispute resolutions. So it can become tricky, as you can see, if you start going into dispute or a form of debates and confrontation. One needs to appreciate that this could become quite cumbersome. It could become quite difficult, as one is not always able to know, as this is not something that is taken up lightly, and there's not a lot of precedent or case law on this, as much as what one would like, as you have in other situations on international tax. And it's becoming more and more relevant as we see there's a lot of changes that take place in various jurisdictions. So the financial services and regulatory treaties, there you also have a reality of where there's loss of passporting rights, and to use an example, the new UK-Switzerland Financial Services Agreement, and that allows easier market access. So one needs to understand although we're referring to what happens pre and post-Brexit, these are situations that will help and support many people and businesses to do what they need to do. If we go further and we look at the dispute resolution and legal framework, they are no longer subject to the European Court of Justice, as the UK courts no longer recognize the European Court of Justice rulings. However, the EU still affects Northern Ireland under the Northern Ireland Protocol. And then you have the WTO trade disputes, which the UK is now independently represented at the WTO, meaning it must defend its own trade disputes without relying on the EU. So it's quite interesting if you look at the impact of all of this. And then you have your migration and social security treaties. There's no more freedom of movement. As you can think, the UK ended free movement of people, affecting work visas, residence permits, and so forth. But it doesn't mean you're not able to get something like that in place from a visa point of view. Then you have the UK-EU Social Security Agreement, which signed that treaty, ensuring some coordination of pensions and benefits. And then the last point, which I just want to mention is in summary, is the Brexit's impact on the UK's treaty network is that the UK had to replace the EU free trade agreements. They signed new deals. The tax treaties, the DTAs remain in force, but the UK lost the EU parent subsidiary directive, the PSD benefits. Then you have investment treaties, which happen is the UK, the business investment treaties remain valid, but EU investment protections lost. And as one can see, there's a few things that get lost from an EU point of view, as that's not anymore applicable. The UK lost passporting rights, now it relies on the equivalence agreements for those situations. And the UK no longer subject to the European Court of Justice rulings and must defend the WTO trade disputes independently. And there's no more free movement. So as one or two last final thoughts, I would just say the UK has restructured its treaty network, and due to Brexit, there are new barriers to trade, tax, and finance that were introduced. The trade agreements were renegotiated with a focus on global expansion beyond the EU, and the trade treaties remain largely unchanged, but withholding taxes increased due to the loss of EU in directives. The UK's investment treaty protections weakened as it lost its EU level legal backing. And I think I might just say one more last time, it's quite important that people look into getting proper counsel and advice when you sit in situations where this could be applicable.